All
All
right.
right. Sweet. Do you see there's because there's a top? Do you got the countdown on your end? The top left hand corner. It says live.
Live for however much time.
Okay, you got the same.
Yep.
Cool.
Yep. We're good.
Nice. So what's up?
Oh well, not an overwhelming amount. I'm just kind of sitting here listening to people shoot off their fireworks and hoping they don't light the woods on fire.
Uh, yeah. I mean, you gotta love the rocket's red glare.
Yeah, and all the bombs bursting in air. Just it's their embers you gotta watch out for.
I don't know why they legalized M80s, but I guess it was a good decision.
Because a lot of fireworks stands are making a lot of money, and they're probably getting a pretty good amount of taxes off of that.
But they're like, hey, you know what's the best kind of explosives? Legal explosives.
Yep, legislated freedom. Gotta love it.
How does that happen, though? I mean, I figured you might have to have a revolution to have legislated freedom.
It's almost like the revolution was so that the freedom didn't have to be legislated.
Oh man,
That they
that
apparently
is
thought.
that is that could be very well be a South Park episode. I mean, I might as well the parody that could be.
The parody called the United States of America.
Some days I feel like it's less of a parody. Some days I think it's just an absolute joke. But I mean, as open ended, like we talked about, beforehand, as open ended as American conservatism is, did
Mhm.
you or do you think that the esteemed founding fathers would have even thought that what it's evolved into now? Would you think it would have even crossed their minds?
Well, not in the exact way it did for sure. There are elements of it that certain more radical members of them, like honestly, people talk about Jeffersonianism a lot,
Hmm.
but on the individual level, I really don't think Jefferson would have as much of a problem with a lot of the individual liberties and just the mass democracy and things like that some people think.
Hmm.
He'd certainly have a problem with how it was implemented and all the inconsistencies and such with it. But he was very radical for his time. People forget that they lump him in with the Southern conservative tradition, but he was kind of an oddball actually. He's kind of a topic all in himself.
He's got to be one of the most like philosophically endearing uh, founding fathers there has to be. Like he was, I mean, he was almost on a Plato and Aristotle kind of level with his writings, his musings, the way he just talked about governance. I mean, the guy was just so incredibly ahead of his time when it came to thinking about those things and solving those problems and trying to find proper the proper legislation for it without wanting to be tyrannical with it, which I think kind of makes him an oddball overall for politics. So, I mean, given the time period, there was only essentially one party. He wasn't a part of, a lot of those, pretty much all the way up until the Civil War, there was one party in the United States. But then, they had to govern different factions. So it was all kind of interconnected, but at the same time, you did have those outliers like Jefferson.
Yeah, the party system and the development of it in the United States is an interesting topic in itself. Um, it wasn't so much right up until the Civil War. It was a little bit before that. In 1854 is when the Republican Party was founded.
Mm-hmm.
This is the beginning of really the party system that we can relate to today. I mean, the Whigs and the Democrats, the Whigs were essentially a permanent opposition party. Like, they never really had institutional power the same way that the Democrats did.
Mm-hmm.
Um, People see them as a precursor to the Republicans, but that's not entirely true. They had different platforms. Um, and then, of course, you had the Federalists, who represented a whole strain of thought in American political discourse that's kind of gone under the radar. It
Mm-hmm.
has very slowly reemerged over time, first through the Republicans, and then just going on later into the Democratic Party much, much later. But people forget about the Federalists. They forget just how much influence they ended up eventually having, just in an indirect way.
Okay. Yeah, because I mean, a lot of neocons do love to get into the whole federalist kind of aspects of the United States. Obviously, federalist cornerstone would probably be, well, their biggest one that they hammer on is limited government, and that aligns with, well, the different factions of the right wing, libertarian, basically paleo conservatism. I don't know, I guess anarcho capitalism. Not so much corporatism, because corporatism can get out of hand real fast. But I mean, those would probably be the main three factions that I can think of right off the top of my head. Because, well, I don't want to get too much into the boomer tier mega conservatives. I'll spare you that whole thing. But it is interesting because a lot of people, when they think of, federalism, they probably think of overt government. They don't think of, what it once was, which the Federalists promoted limited government.
Limited, but notably more extensive than their opponents. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, they were. The Federal Federalist is talking about the power of the federal government. They're the ones who promoted the federal government having more power overall. Um, they had sort of a bit more corporatist, I would say, outlook than their Democratic Republican opponents. And ultimately, that was seen as being, I guess, kind of un American by a lot of the other sections outside of New England. Even the New Englanders abandoned it eventually. But yeah, that whole legacy is kind of just lost. Like, you don't really see almost, because I've actually seen outright fascists say that the Federalist Party was some lost aspect of it. And while I think they're definitely stretching to say that that's somehow related to like fascism or something like that, I can see where they come from, right? Because Hamilton was in favor of a centralized, for more for the sake of efficiency than anything, type of state. Um, while definitely he really just wanted to have the United Kingdom again, but in the United States. Like, he was fundamentally just a conservative in that way. Um, I'm not too sure what his opinions on monarchy were, but he may have also been one of the monarchist founders, of which there were more than people realize.
Okay. And that definitely segues into the spirit of revolution. What a perfect topic for the 4th of July. So, monarchists, are definitely few and far between. I think more so nowadays than they probably ever have been, probably almost any time in history. Um, but in the spirit of revolution, a lot of people who consider themselves to be on the right see revolution as a disdain or a revolt against God. They don't see it as something that is a noble act to get out from under tyrannical government. And going through public school, that's one of those things where we were always taught that that's that spirit of revolution. The ideas of liberty, pursuit of happiness, justice for all, free speech, all the Bill of Rights, that whole shtick, granted under the Constitution. Well, obviously, with conservatism, it's becoming less and less important because, someone can't say something controversial online because the next day they're going to, have the rug supposedly swept out from under them because somebody who is a social justice warrior will find them, dox them, and make sure they're blacklisted from whatever industry they can, whilst they provide for their family or, they need that job to survive. So it's kind of become a strange, kind of warped view on revolution from where it started to where it is now. And I know I'm definitely glossing some stuff over with that statement. But as far as I don't have a milquetoast view like most Americans when it comes to Christianity, but I think the whole interjection of thinking there's a spirit of revolution that is godless, I don't so much agree with that. Obviously, there is a kingdom, and the ultimate kingdom, is in heaven. But as far as an earthly kingdom is concerned, there has been plenty of monarchs who were revolted against, and rightfully so. And there are plenty of monarchs who were, some of the greatest rulers of all time. I wouldn't call Constantine a monarch, but essentially he was. Charlemagne comes to mind. As far as another great king, probably King Alfred. And then I've heard of, and I don't know much about him, King Edward II. And then leading all the way up to the American Revolution, was it King George II or the Third?
Well, before we talk about George, not Edward II. You're thinking Edward I, Longshanks.
Edward the First. Okay.
Yeah, the
Okay.
second was he was a sodomite. So yeah,
oh boy,
we'll gloss over that. But I was like, I know who he's talking about. I better jump in real quick. Yeah, but George III,
okay,
House of Hanover, who became King of Great Britain in 1760. And yeah, you have to keep in mind with the context of the American Revolution, it happened a very short time after the 7 Years' War, which we know in America as the French and Indian War. And this was essentially World War Zero, you could call it that, because it was just about the first major war between European powers that involved conflicts in theaters all around the globe. So mostly between the British and the French. They were fighting in America, they were fighting in India, and in Europe, alongside a bunch of other powers like the Prussians. But the significance for our topic of this war is that it involved the complete British takeover of just about all French possessions in North America. So all of Canada, all of all French territory to the Mississippi River. So that whole uh, just Mississippi line of colonies they'd established, like St. Louis and Detroit and all that, um, the whole Great Lakes area, etc. Now, the French pulled a fast one by actually giving Louisiana to the Spanish right before the peace treaty to keep it out of the British hands. Otherwise, they would have controlled most of the actual modern United States, at least on paper. Um, but yeah, if you look at a map of the North American continent in 1763, right after the war ended, yeah, it's just a giant red blob. It's red and it's yellow. There's Britain and Spain, and that's just about it, except for the Russians up in Alaska. Um, so yeah, you had this massive continent-spanning empire with all this new land out west that the highly populated English colonies on the coast were highly eager to push inland and explore and exploit. But this war had cost the British Crown dearly, largely due to its financing of its continental allies against the French and their allies. And so, not only did a lot of these taxes start to come into play, which were justified by the fact that British troops had to come from England to defend the American colonies against the French and Indians, but also the proclamation line was declared along the Appalachians. The Proclamation Line of 1763 essentially was a decree straight from King George, and this is another unique thing. This was not a parliamentary decree. This actually came from the mouth of the king himself. And it just said, hey, Englishmen do not go west of the Appalachians. And the reason for that, even though they technically controlled lands of the Mississippi, was in order not to rile up the native tribes in the area, to prevent another war from breaking out that would drain more resources from the crown. But this incensed the colonists. I would say, it was the single biggest reason for the revolution, because there are different reasons that caused different areas to join it. Like, there was some fear in the South, I believe, over abolition. Very, very early strains of British abolitionism. It wasn't a big movement at the time, but the murmurs of it were starting to begin. And up north, it was a lot more about taxes and the ideas of religious liberty, and the Puritans. They had a much more revolutionary strain about them to begin with. But the common theme across all 13 colonies was that damn proclamation line, which it wasn't very effective. You had especially the Scotch-Irish and the Appalachians could just cross it at will, and there was really no way to control that. But it was just the symbolism of it. It's like, how dare you, act against the interests of your people by keeping us from, taking over this land that we, technically own as a nation. So that was a huge controversy. But anyway, yeah, there's many different factors that led to the revolution, and I agree with some of them, and I disagree with others. So before I get into that, because I've been talking for long enough, what's your take on that? How much do you know about the various different causes, and what are your opinions on them?
Well, you said something pretty interesting there too. Obviously, the proclamation line, for us in the North, was it like that big of a piece of history for us as it was for the South? I don't know. We more so look out west, with the Louisiana Purchase, and that dictating some of the war. And then as far as the different factions go, we definitely, know about that, because the Minutemen were all around the United States. They weren't just condensed to the New England area, albeit they're probably way more popular when it comes to the New England area. But as far as the Revolutionary War coming to the Midwest, I mean, I don't know how, haven't don't really have a history of it being over here and them fighting the Revolutionary War here when it comes to local history. But as far as the French, English, and well, we don't really have a Spanish influence here in the Midwest as to what they fought for, but we definitely know by a lot of the Native American tribes, they outright hated the war, both sides. Because on one side, they were obviously getting genocided by, well, what would become the American settlers. And on the other side, they just wanted to be left alone by the British. And for the most part, from what I know, is the British did leave them alone. They didn't fuss with them. They didn't, they weren't looking to take over or enslave Native Americans. And that makes sense because I've heard of plenty of stories where, the trading would go on between the English and the Native Americans. And then the French capitalizing off of all that by them turning a quick buck. And then the French coming in to places like Detroit and settling. And outright just ignoring what we were doing as Americans and what the British were doing. And they just decided to take it upon themselves to establish trade and become, have more streams of commerce for France. But what I don't really know, to be honest, is how the monarchy was involved and how they played a part as the American Revolution went along. You obviously hear about things like the Boston Tea Party, the Minutemen, like I mentioned, of course, the Gadsden flag, don't tread on me, and things of that in that spirit of revolution and the tall tales that surround it. And obviously a figure that we all know as Americans that has been so important in history is the tall tale of George Washington. He was kind of by like divine providence. He never suffered a shot in battle, never suffered a wound in battle, and was an esteemed military commander. I mean, by the end of the Revolutionary War, they wanted to declare him king. And he said, well, isn't that the whole point? We fought this war to not have a king. So, going back to that and knowing more about the Puritans and their spirit of, their brand of Protestantism. On one hand, they were highly problematic. On the other hand, they had a righteous cause, and they wanted every bit of it. They wanted to become something more than what the monarchy led up to that point in England. And I do know from what I've heard about King George that he actually was a decent monarch. He was a decent king. So in the spirit of revolution, I've heard this point argued a couple different ways, but the one that stuck out to me the most is you're defying a monarchy. So in turn, you're defying a divine kind of government from God. And obviously, we know history memed is not as bad as it's made out to be. But with somebody like King George, who was such an influential figure for the time period, I read a little blurb about him and the whole Boston Tea Party, demonstration, quote unquote, and it didn't, some of it didn't add up, some of it made sense, but to what they were revolting against, it was more so the angle that they just wanted to create their own nation just for the sake of creating their own nation. It wasn't supposed to be an extension of a monarchy. It wasn't supposed to be an extension of anything else. And then in turn, eventually it would turn into, well, what we have today, which most people on the dissident right just think it's communism by the back door is the best way I could describe it, is what a lot of them think it is, when in turn the reality is absolutely different. And then you mentioned something about Hamilton and fascism, which was kind of unique. I've never heard that expressed quite like that. And I don't know much about Hamilton, I'll be honest with you. Hamilton he was like one of the first, he was the founding father who established the banks, right?
He was in favor of them. Yeah.
Okay.
He had the first Bank of the United States, which was short-lived, and then the second one was later, but it was kind of operating on the same principles.
Okay. So he's the one who wanted the whole, that was pretty much against what Jefferson wanted, from what I know. Jefferson didn't want a currency that was bank owned, or was it? It had to be intrinsically something that has intrinsic value, like gold or silver, and it had to be backed by a precious metal. So I know Hamilton opposed that, and he wanted to establish central banks. That's as far as I know. And it's kind of a mishmash by this point. But as far as that angle that has been presented to me, I thought that was the most interesting angle as far as the revolution being in defiance of something. When you're defying a monarch, you're essentially defying God. I thought that was a very interesting perspective on the revolution. So go ahead.
Yeah, people can look at it that way. I think that a lot gets overplayed with how anti-monarchical the revolution supposedly was. You have to keep in mind, like, that was far from unanimous among even the rebelling colonists, let alone everybody. It's said that roughly a third supported the revolution, a third were against it, and a third didn't care. And you always hear the 3% thing about the 3% that supposedly actually fought, at least on the side of the revolution. But, even within that group, there was a great diversity of opinions regarding the monarchy. Early in the war, especially before the sides had kind of gotten hardened against one another, and it became clear that King George wasn't going to compromise, there was a very common theme of, we're loyal to the king, but not to Parliament. The issue at first was much more with the elected Parliament in England itself, and of their lack of representation therein. rather than the king, who really hadn't done anything to them in person other than like the proclamation line by that point. A lot of the hate that got directed at him later was because he was the figurehead. He was the person who physically represented Britain to the colonists. And then, of course, you had a lot of later Republican mythology, especially during the 20th century, that got added in, that created this sort of mythos that we know today. So, as far as Hamilton goes, yeah, that fascism thing was kind of a one-off. Like, I just heard a couple of them make that argument, mostly just because it was a more centralized government. I don't put much credence to it, in fact. The central banking had a lot more to do with what his interest group was, which was Northeastern, predominantly New Englander and New Yorker financial concerns, and sort of the very early churnings of the Industrial Revolution. And they just wanted that bank so they could acquire more finance to engage in, to have more capital, to have more resources in order to invest into these projects that they were creating. The South opposed it because it was, well, one, it invited an inflationary currency, and two, it just put more power in the hands of their opponents, who were not, landed people, who had a fundamentally different idea of how the country should be run. They want a strong central government that could redirect money from, say, these wealthy Southern planters and put it into infrastructure, which mostly benefited the North because it was things like canals on the Great Lakes, like the Erie Canal, and then early railroads and things of that sort. So it was just conflicting interests determined a lot of the party loyalties during the early Republic.
I missed part of what you said because the stream cut off. But yeah, were you? And I'm gonna bring up eighth grade. For me, eighth grade history class again. No taxation without representation. I mean, that's been echoed. I think. I mean, it's obviously one of those things where that's going to kind of spurn a revolution no matter what. And then what you said about, well, the mythos of what the Republicans have came up with in the 20th century, that mythos kind of gets applied to the, both the Russian Orthodox Church and the Rokor Church with St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas and the Romanov family that were killed during that revolution. And that revolution was primarily a revolution to not quite overthrow the monarchy, but keep in place the monarchy, and the opposite of what the Americans revolted against. They wanted a parliament in place to offset the monarchy, which kind of became a withered down autocracy by that point, because it wasn't functioning on a level that was even good for Russia. And a lot of people directed, naturally, their anger towards the Tsar, the king. So with the parliament being rebelled against in the American sense, it's the opposite when it comes to when you break that down and see why the Red Revolution took off, and obviously it was undermined, and taken advantage of, because that was not the original point for the Red Revolution. Whereas ours was against that, but then you get the take where it was against the monarchy. As far as it being against the parliament, Was it more so because of those laws, like no taxation without representation? Obviously, that being a big one for the revolution to happen, and then establishing a completely new country, and that was also tied into and roped into the religious persecution that they were going under. So they, had to find a way out, because obviously they thought the government was tyrannical and overbearing in England, and with that main mode of government being a monarchy, that's corrupt in a different sense. You go from that period in history to where the monarchy was overbearing, and you had a parliament that was out of control, and basically, I mean, kind of going full Puritan. I mean, kind of just going off the rails and just completely thinking everything is, a sin. To the Red Revolution in Russia, to Tsar Nicholas being looked down upon and not being able to, come to grips with how to deal with it, and him, he would have had a parliament, or some kind of governing body, probably established by his predecessors. I mean, well before he ever came to power, if it wasn't for a corrupt Russian Orthodox Church at the time. So, as much as they want to blame who and the Red Revolution on top of it for the murder of the Romanov family, part of the issue is, as ironic as this sounds, is how overtly corrupt a lot of the patriarchy and the hierarchy within the Russian Orthodox Church was at the time. So when you get that whole the spirit of revolution is in defiance of God. Well, when you have people who are supposed to serve God that compromised and that overtly corrupt and creating problems not only for themselves but the people that they're supposed to be serving in good faith, then everybody's going to kind of share that spirit of revolution in a sense. So when I see something like, and as a northerner, when I see something, or as a damn Yankee, I'll say it, like the Gadsden flag, that's something that invokes a free willing kind of spirit, but in a free willing kind of spirit, in a godly kind of sense, not in a sense to where we're just revolting like a punk kid who's revolting against their parents because he got a bad grade on a math test. I mean, that's probably kind of an infantile kind of way to look at it. But to what the spirit of revolution has kind of become, well, I mean, it's kind of.
You cut out there for a second. Can you hear me? I've got completely like dead air on your end, man. I can't hear a single thing you're saying.
Hold on. Let me mute. Can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you now.
Aha. So it did that. Where did it cut off at?
It cut off right as you were right after you had the spiel about the punk kid. Like you're saying, well, the spirit of revolution, and then you cut off.
Okay, so like the spirit of revolution with the punk kid, he can't get out of a report card because the report card is going to be sent directly to his parents' email, so he can't get out of getting a D or an F in math class because he's been maybe gawking at a girl too long, or trying to get out of that class to maybe go to gym class with his buddies because that's more fun. And I'm not going to say anything personal, but that's something I did. So
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like that's, and I'm not, even going to. I don't think anybody really that has any knowledge on the topic is in good faith going to assume that that's what people are always doing, right? Like most people don't rebel just to rebel. Like it's really a very small segment of the population. Um, and there's some implications there that you're probably tired of hearing, but yeah, that will foment these types of revolts for their own ends or just because they're naturally rebellious, usually against God. But going back to Imperial Russia, I've never heard the take before that the Orthodox Church was somehow responsible for the regime being corrupt, or that the church being corrupt essentially led to the revolution. I know that the Duma, the Russian parliament, that got instated in 1905 and then repealed a couple years later, and then they brought it back with the February Revolution. That's another thing. Russia had two revolutions. They had the February one and the October one. The October one was the actual Red Revolution everybody remembers. The February one was a revolution by liberal aristocrats and bourgeoisie who were trying to pretty much put their own interests in the Russian government, right? They didn't like the autocracy of the Tsar, and they sort of found an opportunity to do this by the fact that Russia was not doing very well in World War One at all. But the thing is, I really find it hard to actually blame any of this on the Tsarist government, at least as a system, right? Like Nicholas II, blessed though he was, he just fundamentally was not made for rulership. He wasn't like his father. If you know anything about Alexander III, the Tsar before him, I guarantee you, if he was around in 1917, they would not have tried that, because this man was a huge czar who he had like legendary strength. Like there are tales about him bending pennies with his or kopecks, wherever they call them, with his thumb and finger. Most famously, though, there was an assassination attempt on him by the communists, and he held up the roof of a train collapsing on his family, including the young boy Nicholas, and saved them from the communists. But the injuries from that, I think, to his liver eventually caused him to get an illness from that and then eventually die. But yeah, like he didn't have the strength of his father, and that was really the key thing. He wasn't willing to deal with these, frankly, satanic revolutionaries, for at least in the communist case, in the way that needed to be done, and so unrest piled up, and then amid World War One, which Russia was losing for very intrinsic reasons, right? Like it was going to take years for Russia to actually develop to the point where it could really do anything good in that war. Yeah, it was just a perfect storm for the Romanov monarchy. I've never really heard that before, though. Once again, that the church really had anything to do with that, any more so than any other state church or institution, or that I've just never been convinced that parliamentarianism would have really helped anything in that case. Alexander II, who reigned from the 1850s to the 1880s. He had plans to implement a parliament, and then he actually got assassinated by the communists, the anarchists at the time, sort of the predecessors of them. And that is what made his son Alexander III crack down so hard on them. He issued a document, like an ukaz, an imperial edict, that had probably the most base name for a document I've ever heard. And it was called the Manifesto on Unshakable Autocracy. And basically, it's him saying, okay, I'm done playing. You killed my dad. And, I see that and I'm just like, based. But anyway, yeah, I'm kind of interested to hear about that narrative of church corruption and how that supposedly caused the revolution.
Okay, so there's a historian. His name is Dan Carlin, and he talked about people forgetting the February Revolution, leading up to what was the weakened state to the Red Revolution in October, the true one. At the time, Alexander III, who you mentioned, yeah, I mean, the guy was a badass. I mean, they called him a Russian bear for a reason. I mean, the guy was just, yeah. Paul Bunyan kind of comes to mind when I think of him. And there was a very well, there was a split on the patriarchy in the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, that is. And a lot of them fled. A lot of them fled from the church and didn't want anything to do with it because of how much they've taken advantage of this. And to this day, they still have problems with it. Obviously, you had the span of the KGB, but more so, it was just the overt corruption. The priests taking advantage of the commoners, and the priests becoming, I mean, basically like your Baptist preachers. They were just, taking donations and taking advantage of the faithful and living very lavish lifestyles. Alexander put a little bit of a stop to it. But when it comes to, the symphonia that Russia tried to strike with its monarchy and autocracy, by that point, it was just such a given, such a state, an institution. I mean, it was unshakable. It was just as strong, if not stronger, than the government. So think of it in a Pope role, in a Vatican kind of sense. I mean, they had that much power. And they took advantage of it. So by that point, the people were angry. The people were mad that these priests were getting away with this stuff. And I mean, that's basically why the working class wanted to rise up and get out from underneath a corrupt government, and more so a corrupt church. And they still wanted to keep, obviously, the Orthodox Church going, because, I mean, if it wasn't for the Orthodox Church, I think a lot of Russia probably would be still wild and uncivilized, because they are some tough people. But a lot of it was due to a corrupt patriarchy. And you know what? I don't know who the patriarch was at the time, but I know the well, from what I've heard, the Romanovs were pretty much fed up with him by the end. By the end of it all, they didn't want to deal with him, and he was being blamed for stuff. Well, then they had the scapegoat of Rasputin, and from a lot of what Rasputin was blamed for, it actually wasn't true. A lot of tall tales, have come about with probably one of the most mythical figures, in a sense, of the church, was actually the direct opposite. Rasputin was actually somebody who aspired to, he wanted to be a saint of the church. I mean, the guy wanted to be a holy man, and they needed a scapegoat. So from what I've heard is the patriarch, used him as a political scapegoat, and the Romanovs by that point were getting very tired of how church business was being handled within the monarchy. And that's another reason why the people wanted a parliamentary system and an autocracy. So from Dan Carlin's perspective, and leading up to World War I, and Russia already being in a weakened state, that is what Dan Carlin had to say on it. And I honestly never heard that take before either. And from what I do know, though, is that looking back on it and knowing something, because I obviously I don't know as much about the Russian or the Slavic side of the faith, and how how their lineage has happened. But from what I do know is that the Russian Orthodox Church has had a history of corruption, and it hasn't been favorable to the faithful of Russia that I do know.
Yeah. You keep mentioning the patriarch, right? The thing is, the Russian Orthodox Church actually had abolished its patriarchate. Peter the Great, he actually abolished the Russian patriarchate, and he created the Holy Synod, which was the collection of archbishops that he had under a procurator that he appointed. So he created a imperial government office that was an appointed position, that was a cabinet minister in essence, that was over these bishops. And so there was no patriarchate up until the February Revolution. The Russian patriarchate under Kirill, I think was his name, got reestablished in 1917 during that interlude between the two revolutions. But yeah, under the Romanov monarchy after Peter, there was no Russian patriarch. The head of the church was basically the Tsar. It was much more a situation almost like the Church of England, where the monarch, it was head of church and state, a very absolutist sort of thing that Peter started.
Yeah, you're talking about the Synod of Moscow that had to be implemented because the patriarch had gotten so corrupt by that point. And it was a synod that happened, well, and the Synod of Moscow actually kind of came out too due to survival reasons for the Orthodox Church too, because you have to remember the unofficial capitals of the faith were obviously Constantinople being the main one, but it eventually had to move north to St. Petersburg and then eventually to Moscow for the entire faith to survive. And then they officially moved it back to Constantinople because of the Ottoman Turks, and the persecution that Constantinople was almost constantly under. So they had to move those synods, or they had to move those They had to move those capitals around to be able for the faith to survive, both historically and canonically.
I mean, well, there is that, right? But honestly, that's more just specifically a Russian thing. The entire Orthodox Church, as far as I know, the sort of head patriarch of all the churches, pretty much, I mean, head patriarch insofar as that's a thing, but, the one that sort of was the authority that everybody in the Balkans and everybody outside of Russia theoretically still answered to was Constantinople. There was a lot of controversy over that later on when Bulgaria and Serbia and these other Balkan nations seceded from the Ottomans and created their own patriarchates. It was very begrudgingly that Constantinople granted Russia autocephaly in, I believe, the 17th century. So, yeah, and this was in Moscow. They only moved to St. Petersburg during Peter's reforms. He abolished the Moscow Patriarchate, created his synod in St. Petersburg, and it remained there until the fall of the monarchy. But, yeah, you could say the center of the church in a more unofficial sense moved to Russia, which it did. I mean, Russia was the only remaining Orthodox power. So politically, it was definitely there. And you see the tension between Constantinople and the Russian church over this day, between the historical role that Constantinople holds and the greater political power that the Russian church has. And there's many accusations of arrogandizement from Constantinople to the Russians. And then the Russians would then accuse Constantinople of being compromised or impure because of Turkish occupation or now Western influence and things like that.
And you've just deduced every Telegram Orthodox argument ever. Because that's basically what it all boils down to. And in that spirit of, I guess, a revolution, and the Russian Orthodox Church has had a huge problem with the, I guess you could call it a falling away in a sense from the tradition of what the Greek Orthodox Church still stands for, because that's the ecumenical patriarch, the first among equals in Constantinople. But the problem is that Constantinople is and has always been in Turkey. It's not a part of Greece. And that has led to a lot of problems. And being in the Greek Orthodox Church that has never strayed away from the faith, that has never strayed away from it becoming an overt problem. But Constantinople still stands. It still is there as a historical place of reference for the faith. But the problem with the Slavs is they've always had that chip on their shoulder. They've always had that sense of, okay, well, if you guys can't hold on to Constantinople, then we'll just take it over. Then it's our faith. And then, like you said, the fact that Moscow was granted autocephaly outside of Constantinople, yeah, I mean, they did see it in a sense as a political reason, but we see it as, well, there needs to be another extension of the faith. There needs to be another place for the faith to go for it to survive. So, and us, and us not obviously being under the spirit, under like something like the Vatican, having a centralized power structure, and it being that being the only center of power, which in a way this is going to relate to where we're going to go with the American Revolution, and that having that centralized power be a a that centralized power obviously playing a role in where am I going with it? What's the word I'm looking for? Playing a role in the development of the faith, how it grew, how it had to survive throughout history, because I think the decentralization and the autocephaly of the churches throughout, like you said, the Balkans, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Russia, parts of Asia, parts of North Africa, has obviously helped it survive and stand the test of time. To whereas what's happening with Rome now, they're decaying. Obviously, people are turning away from Catholicism because they see the internal rot. They see the decadence. They see what probably the Russians saw, probably what the revolutionary minds of America saw, as that aristocratic bourgeoisie decadence that led them to say, we're better than this. We can be in that spirit of a higher value system. And something that is coming to my mind now is and this is something that comes up almost most of the time when I'm on Telegram. It's kind of a nerd moment, I guess, but you take a I don't know if you're a Dune fan, but you take a planet like Caladan, and then you take a planet like Harkonnen, and you think about like the things that they value. You think about the things that they promoted, the virtues that they had. Well, there's a sense of good in the people of Caladan, and then there's a sense of overt corrupt evil in the people of Harkonnen, or the House Atreides and House Harkonnen. So Caladan is House Atreides, Harkonnen is House Harkonnen, and you get that. I guess you call it esoteric vibes of something on a more literature level, and you could allegorize it into the context of a revolution. And what virtues do you want to stand for? Do you want to stand for like what House Atreides stood for? Justice, truth, well, I'm not going to say equality because I know that's quite a pot stirrer. Like all the virtues that should be strived for in society, versus Harkonnen, where they're all like the awful ones. Like they'll stab you in the back no matter what, and they want power no matter what it takes. They much as well slit each other's throats if one of them gets to hoard the gold at the end of it. So it's something like that I guess as an allegory, I'm trying to tie this into like how probably the revolutionaries in America saw what the parliament was. They saw them as, putting all the onus on the monarchy, they don't, they probably didn't want to do that, because I know historically they didn't want to do that because of the autocephaly that we wanted in our own churches in America, that the Puritans wanted to establish, and they did establish for a long time. There was autocephaly in the United States when it came to the churches. That changed, obviously, before and after the Revolutionary War, or the Civil War, thanks to Lincoln. But for a long time, there were state churches. They were going towards their own sense of, well, I guess, symphonia. They went towards their own sense of having that religious freedom in the United States. And by that point in time, the religious freedom hinged around mainly Protestant Christianity. So having a corrupt monarchy or parliament, and them having control over something like a religion, something like, somebody's free speech, I feel like, in a sense, that whole, being against a monarchy is against God. Well, what happens if the people who are in power, aren't, extending God's will?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's just the counterpoint to that, though, is that rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God, which is sort of the counterpart to the whole divinely ordained monarchy, and revolt against it is revolt against God, but that all has to do with duty. Why is the monarch ordained by God? Because he assumes the duty of the father over the family that is his kingdom. That is fundamentally all natural order. The reason that monarchy is good, the reason that it's a divinely ordained system, is because it is based on the family. That is the only government outside of the judges of Israel that God ever gave us. The family. And a monarchy is really just an extrapolation of the family structure upwards. When I think of an organic society, I think of everything being based on families. You've got, clans, you've got, what have you, and just being extensions of that nuclear structure going further and further up until you have the king as patriarch of the nation. That's sort of my idealized view anyway. I understand that it rarely actually works completely like that because of historical factors, but that's sort of that natural, and that's sort of the perfect symphonia, right? You have the patriarch of the nation, and then ideally the patriarch of the church along with them. And yeah, you have the church structure and the episcopates and things like that being a similar hierarchical structure. But, anyhow, that's really it. It's just that, if people aren't doing their duties, no matter what position they're in, then their position essentially becomes null and void. If a father isn't being a proper father, if he's a deadbeat dad, then once again, you're like, well, what right does this person have if they're abusing this child? What right do they have to continue to, hold and be the effective father of this child if they're doing these things? It's the same principle.
I mean, yeah, I can't really disagree with any of that, because dysfunction is never going to lead to anything good. You see it clear across the board, because the extension of, the monarchy is the extension of the family. And that's interesting that you brought up what government structure outside of Israel was ordained by God, and not a whole lot of people, say that it should be the family. People want to hammer in, monarchy, symphonia. Especially those that aren't Catholic or Protestant. I'll say that. But, and conservatives like to really hammer on this point. Oh, this is an attack against the family. This is an attack on our American values as a people. This is, you got to beware. It's always the boogeyman in the closet with the left, while the left is, well, we know who the left is obsessed with. I don't have to say his name. And, their spirit of revolution comes from a different place. Do I still think conservative Christians exist in America? Yes. Do I still think that's in the majority? Yes. Despite the numbers, despite what people want to, make a big deal about. I still think that there is that underlying duty to do the right thing, and there's still that underlying spirit of that, that revolution against tyranny, that revolutionary spirit against tyranny that is obviously godless. I mean, it's so apparent on how godless it has all become. And, people think that if they have a righteous cause for themselves, well, that's cause enough for me to go out and do anything. I can promote and say and do anything that I want to. Okay. I mean, yeah, in America, that's kind of what it is all about. But are you going to have a righteous cause to where, on the dissident right, people like to hammer in another political figure that I'm not going to really go into here. But like they like to hammer the pavement with him. And the problem with that is that there's a spirit of revolution kind of attached to that, but there's also a sense and an embodiment of a wrong spirit of revolution. Like the liberal left wants to have the same spirit that, the godless left, I guess is one of the best ways I could say it. But they want to have that spirit of revolution. They have that wanting to have it constantly, because they think that their cause, their virtue signaling, their flavor of the month flag, I guess is gonna bring about some kind of much needed change because the system just doesn't understand them. Well, without God, without contributing to society, without being a decent person, and as one of my favorite internet dads and now granddads likes to say it, clean your room, because you can't start a revolution if you can't if you can't clear your mind or figure out your own life before you start telling others what to do, which is probably one of the simplest pieces of advice, but probably one of the best pieces of advice probably anybody could ever hear, especially if they're, super sensitive and they don't really have, a father figure in their lives. But that rings true. I mean, that whole idea of getting your ducks in a row before you start to tell others what to do. I mean, that's gonna cause rifts no matter where it goes. And when it comes to the spirit of revolution, that is essentially what they were doing. The founding fathers and the revolutionaries of this country felt it was their duty, and a lot of them said their God-given duty to revolt, to say, hey, enough is enough. We need to do something more about this. So to me, the whole all the founding fathers were Freemasons. Founding fathers were, they were evil and satanic, and they were secretly communist. Well, communism probably wasn't even, definitely wasn't even around during that time period. And to me, that sounds like another cop out for people who just don't want to do any more research into the history of it,
Yeah, it's convenient, It's a very quick, easy, simple way to look at things. And it also reinforces one's own point of view. If they have a dogmatic view by which, my side, my church, is essentially right about everything, and so everybody else is going to be fundamentally corrupt at some deep level. And I think that that's a very major fallacy that people do. They want to say that, well, what I'm saying is correct because I'm right, not I'm right because what I'm saying is correct. And that's a very fundamental, that's the problem of bias. That's why one has to examine that and see, well, what logic am I coming from here? What am I saying? How am I doing a fact-driven narrative, or am I creating narrative-driven facts? That's basically what it is. So, but yeah, talking about having your own ducks in a row, lest you become the goose. That's kind of right up the alley of that whole Petersonian look on things. And it's not just about cleaning your room. It's not just about little mundane things. It's about just fundamentally having your own life in order. And if you don't have that and you want to impact things beyond yourself, you should ask, why do I want to do this? And should I? Am I really going to be an exemplary person to the people who I want to influence? Because that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to influence other people. And you have to keep in mind that influence and social clout is a holistic thing. It's not just going to be one point that you're hammering home and promoting. That's not all people are going to see and hear when they see and hear you, especially if it's in a video or even better, a real life format. They're going to get the entire picture of you. And so you have to make sure that that picture is right and good and that the contents of it are what you really want people to see. And if there's something wrong, and if you have if you don't have the ability to sit down and really critically analyze yourself, you don't need to be influencing others in the first place. But if you do, and you see that, then ask, what am I doing? What can I do to fix this? Or at least mitigate it before I go into the public sphere. And that's a lot of what people forget to do. They don't tidy the skeletons out of their closet, so to speak, before they go striding out into the world and proclaiming their ideas. And it's not that it discredits the idea, right? They might be perfectly right. They might have a better understanding of the world than 99% of people out there, but they just don't need to be the public face of a movement or what have you when they've clearly got issues of their own for the sake of the movement and that viewpoint itself, because they can discredit themselves without even having flawed logic.
But you said it pretty. That was pretty good. Oh, nothing. There is nothing like narrative driven by absolute conjecture. And I really didn't know much about King George II after getting on Telegram. There was really no talk about him in history class at all whatsoever. And I know that he was a definite influence in the revolution. But he never wanted America to revolt. And a lot of people are like, they kind of balk at that. They get mad. Oh, well, if he never wanted us to revolt, they should have never let us do it in the first place. They should have won the war. They should have won the Revolutionary War. But then you start going into details with what the Revolutionary War was. And as far as like being any like outright battles, kind of like the Civil War, World War I, World War II, you know, they're comparatively, there weren't any like outright battles. You know, there were some major ones for sure. But as far as the majority of it goes, they were all skirmishes. You know, they were all like regional feuds. And it was, you know, it's us winning on our own turf primarily. And I say like, you know, I'm a third generation immigrant. So I'm not really, you know, I guess it's more so tip your hat to you, you know, saying yourself and others who are proud, you know, to be, you know, your heritage and things of that nature. To you know, quantify a monarch who really didn't want to, you know, go against the will of who previously were his own people. You know, he didn't want to have that. And by that point, you know, I mean, I'm sure between the French, you know, like the 7 Years' War and the Spanish, all kind of being trying to become the world superpower and vying for it, you know. And by that point, I've also heard that Britain, by the time the Revolutionary War started, they didn't have a whole lot of resources too. I've heard this take on it too, where by the time it started, that they were not in a good spot. You know, they had limited resources. Their armada didn't do too well because of the many battles with the French and the Spanish. And you know, at that point in time, I know too that the Spanish Armada was bigger than the Queen's fleet, or the fleet of the British Empire. So with all that, they were, by the point we had a revolution, they came to us running on fumes. So, you know, they could argue with how, you know, King George didn't want this to happen kind of viewpoint, but when you're running on limited resources and you can only do so much, and given the time period too, it's not like they were exactly, you know, had technology working in their favor either, where they could, you know, quickly prop things up and get things, and, you know, nothing was instantaneous, and for sure in that time period. That, you know, the disadvantages were definitely working in Symphonia against Britain and the United Kingdom. They were the United Kingdom by that point for sure. But what say you?
Yeah, they became a United Kingdom in 1707. But yeah, people forget that the American War of Independence was only one part of a global war. You know, Britain essentially got stuck in what amounted to the Second 7 Years' War during that war. So let's see, 1775 to 1783. That's an 8 years war. And so Britain, while being kind of exhausted from the 7 Years' War, because you also have to keep in mind how drastic of a war that was for Britain. They and Prussia in that war, which Prussia was still a very new power under Frederick the Great, but that was their only real continental ally other than, you know, Hanover, which they held at the time. They together pretty much fought off a coalition of all the other European powers. At one point in the war, you had the Russians, the Austrians, the French, and the Spanish all together in alliance against the British and the Prussians. Prussia was essentially having to, you know, try to fend off half the armies of Europe on its territory. It got so bad that the Russians actually were marching into Berlin, but then they got lucky because the Tsar died, and then the new Russian Tsar loved the Prussians so much. It was Admiral Frederick. He turned around and went home and left the war. Um, that probably won the war right there, but at least in Europe. And so, yeah, Britain was stuck in what amounted to two global conflicts that had three different theaters each, twice consecutively, with a rather short time in between in the late 18th century. To me, it's kind of miraculous how they recovered so quickly in time for the Napoleonic Wars, or the French Revolutionary Wars anyway, that started in 1792. Um, but yeah, like Britain was at war pretty much constantly with just little breaks in between from 1755 or so all the way up until 1815. And this is when the British Empire sort of becomes the great power that we know of, as being sort of the proto superpower, I'll call it, right? It was first among equals among the great powers by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, in essence. Um, but yeah, and it also marks the transition between the first British Empire and what's called the second British Empire. The first one being the empire, with America and the 18th century British Empire. And then the second one being the one where the crown jewel was India, and where it was the empire in which the sun never set, the classic Victorian empire that we think of, where it wasn't settler colonies for the most part. It was actual, like, rule over native populations. So that was a very big tipping point for them. And that's why the historiography of the revolution in Britain is interesting. So the majority of people, they just seem to kind of ignore it for the most part. They'll see it as being kind of just, and they have the same view of the War of 1812 as just being kind of one theater off in the distance of a much bigger war that they're fighting all across the globe. Like they'll view the war in Europe and the war in India and places like that as being more important to Britain's actual prosperity than the war in America itself. I think that that's very myopic. I think that long term, keeping America would have given the British, maybe not in Britain itself, but would have eventually given the English people a power base so big that, they could be where America is today. But, that's a whole nother discussion.
Well, yeah, and I mean that's the other thing I think that people just forget, like you said, the historiography of what was going on at Britain at the time. And no, I've rarely heard people say, the tale of two empires when it comes to Britain. And I only know that because of, the huge influence of orthodoxy that had on Britain. And obviously the Romans, the Catholic Church, also had a huge influence on Britain. But going into that first stretch of the British Empire, yeah, I mean, it seems like they just never caught a break. Like nobody ever wants to take that into account, and that could be that could definitely be part of the reason as to why America won the Revolutionary War. But what's also kind of interesting is that, in a way, kind of get this attitude nowadays that, Britain just didn't care. They wanted a native population, I guess, to take more so advantage of, and to westernize them, imperialize the population, and have extensions of their empire throughout the world. With us, well, I mean, we thought like them. We could, I mean, we knew our enemies and we knew them well because we were them. And that kind of, I mean, that plays an advantage in war. I mean, if you know your enemy, then they're going to be pretty easy to defeat, because if you already know the moves that they're going to do, well, then you can be 2 steps ahead of them, 3 steps ahead of them, and already know the strategies that they're going to, imply and use against you. So with Britain being to where it was up by that point, I mean, the exhaustion probably that is set in way before that. And that's interesting. I don't know. I do not know a whole lot about Prussian history. And I didn't know that whole factoid. That was pretty cool. But to where, all these different spirits of revolution were going on too. And you had 2 French revolutions go on in their country, and another country that was almost entirely at war for a long time in its history. There was almost times where the French never caught a break either, because they were, well, on top of it, their government was always screwing with them too. But they were a whole nother schizophrenic mess of, God knows what at times. But they in a way too, the French revolutions helped spurned an idea of what American liberalism and, I guess, American conservatism, their views of like libertarianism, are today in both, the Republican and Democrat parties, what they are. And on a more, I guess, existentially philosophical basis, of what they've morphed into and what we idealize and actualize as Americans, on the left or the right, concerning political viewpoints. A lot of it can be traced back to, what the French called, liberal or libertarian. And to me, that obviously English common law helped a lot with this. Greek philosophy, all the tie-ins that you could think of when it comes to the Western ethos. As much as, I don't like to completely give credit to the West, because, we all know there's a Greek grandmother around here somewhere, probably mad about that. But there is, there is certainly a sense of that spirit, that revivalistic viewpoint that the Americans embodied against a very weakened and depleted, and far stretched out empire of what Britain had to fight at the time. And in a sense, we like to glorify that. Our taller than life, larger than life heroes like Paul Revere, George Washington, and, well, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, the Adams brothers, not the Addams family, and all those other important founding fathers that were tied into it. And that's the other thing too, is by their mid-20s, these guys could speak and were fluent in like 3 ancient languages. We're dictating laws to how to establish a country, and probably knew more about philosophy than probably some of the philosophers could even know. And on top of it, the majority of them were, in I'm not going to put my tinfoil hat on for this one, but Christian. They were primarily Christians, so they were headed in a right direction. But as far as well, what's up to snuff now? I mean, I think they could probably run circles around today's politicians because they were so much more well astute. They were so much more well gifted as far as governance goes, and providentially, they probably had something in their favor when it came to opposing and revolting against the British. So, in that whole spirit of revolution, again, there is a definite sense of, well, a united front. And I know that they eventually wanted to states out of those colonies, but where do you think that whole idea came from? That separate but equal states, obviously a federal government, which has become centralized and kind of communist over the decades. But I mean, where do you think that, they got those ideas and how they developed it? And obviously going against a weakened empire like Britain had kind of helped launch it forward and into a more, a unified statehood, and it becoming something that weren't just colonies or an extension of an imperialized empire like Britain.
Well, this actually segues quite well into what I had planned to talk about next, which is you talk about the revolutionary spirit. That's more than one thing. There were two different revolutionary spirits that you could ascribe. And you could look at the French Revolution and the American Revolution and have a very distinct split between those two. Namely their origins of their thought. In the French Revolution, what you have is the Enlightenment. You have humanism, secularism, that fundamentally challenges the role that mostly of the Catholic Church on the continent, and just the very large established state churches that existed up to that point. And this is the seed from which things like the Russian Revolution and communism and the liberal revolutions of 1848, you name it, just about every modern political ideology stems from that train of thought. Now, the counterpoint to this is the American Revolution. And in one phrase, what do I think is really the difference between those two? One supported the concept of the rights of man, a very abstract, belief in just these natural rights that somehow humans have for being humans. Humanism, fundamentally. It's the basis of essentially what's become a religion at this point. And then you have the rights of Englishmen. And this is the key to America, right? No, this rebellion, this revolution would never have happened from any other country other than Great Britain, because no other European country instilled in its people such a sense of their historical liberties and traditions and the concept of self-governance in the way that the British did. They talk about tyrannical Britain. Britain was the most, relatively libertarian country probably in the world at the time. It had the model of a limited monarchy. It had local traditions, a lot of not very much centralization when compared with the French or most other continental empires. These separate colonies became states. They didn't become provinces of a single large entity, largely because of that tradition. just localism in general. It was a fundamental English tradition that they maintained. And bits of Enlightenment influence did creep in, most notably through people like Jefferson. Um, a lot of these states and the colonies before them were theocracies. You had local state churches that were established in each state, like you mentioned earlier. Like Massachusetts, and I believe a couple others were Congregationalist, Puritan, basically, states officially. Like it was their actual state religion. And that's why the whole freedom of religion clause was established. It wasn't to keep religion out of all government. It was to keep it out of the federal government so that the individual states could do as they pleased. And because the different colonies naturally had different religions. It was a way to ease tension in that sense. But, due to that Jeffersonian secular sort of Enlightenment influence, you saw places like Virginia, which was staunchly Anglican, not end up having a state church, which I think that ended up having drastic consequences for Anglicanism and for just those high churches in general later on. But yeah, what you're dealing with, you can't say the spirit of revolution, right? Without really understanding and elaborating what that is and not conflating it with what was going on in these other countries, right? Because it's a different animus every time, or at least a different animus this time when compared with the continental revolutions. It was just fundamentally different in that way.
Because there could even be a spirit of revolution within something like what would be considered freedom of religion, because you could be freely worshiping something that's against God and that's revolting, against him, or against the church, which is pretty interesting, because nobody realizes that a lot of these laws that were established back then were to ease tensions, create more unification, come out of I mean, I don't want to say all of our laws have purely humanistic or post Enlightenment kind of rhetoric attached to it. I think that's more. I think that's become more of a modern phenomena, as it probably wasn't sought as that back then. They probably had to do it more so on a, well, we need to do this because we don't want people coming with pitchforks and torches to come kill us, because we all of a sudden agree with the Pope in Rome, when we fought a whole revolution to get away from that far away taxation without representation. And all of a sudden we got to pay tithes to the Catholic Church when we're Anglican and Protestant, by that time period, Puritan, what have you, when it comes to protesting against the Catholic Church. So you get that sense of where they had to do it on a utilitarian kind of basis to launch a government and have a sense of unification, because without that, how could they have even survived? How could they have even become a community, under the 13 colonies that were almost diametrically opposed to what England wanted to do? But in the same token, too, is that as much as they were opposing England, in a sense, they were kind of becoming like England, because they were trying to set up a system of government that wasn't monarchy in structure, but in a sense, it had to come from somewhere, and a lot of it came from English common law, with touches of the Enlightenment and touches of, all kinds of deist, I guess, non-deist philosophies. I obviously not a whole lot of theology is influenced with them, but it comes into play and it comes into fruition the more you think about how they had to apply laws given to the time period. And a lot of people forget that as well, just on top of forgetting on how stretched out, the United Kingdom was by that point. I mean, there's a lot of these factors that go into this that on a human level, they think that, something else determines that. They think that just, because George Washington was a Freemason, that Freemasons are bad, Freemasons are evil, and they don't believe in God. And, they could just go off on rants about that when, in a sense, he was, a Scottish Rite Freemason. And at the time, it wasn't outright condemned by the church that a lot of people who were becoming Americans didn't follow, because of Anglicanism being a huge influence in England and, basically going against the Pope. I guess it seems like England, people from England just have that revolutionary spirit because, at one point in time, they told the Pope to go fly a kite, and here we are telling the United Kingdom to go fly a kite. So, and funny that I use the term fly a kite because where would we be out without electricity? Thank you, Benjamin Franklin, for attaching the key to that kite. But, it's one of those, it's one of those things where it's funny on how that, there's that mirroring going on, and there's that momentum that gets carried throughout history. And you see that spirit of revolution, I was going to say it, but that, that carrying the torch, that, how Olympian of me to say that, but, that sense of there's always going to be that fire of liberty. There's always going to be, whether it may be the right call or the wrong call, there's going to be that sense of I can do better. We can never do better than God, but as far as a revolutionary kind of mindset, we can do better. We can make things more unified. We can make things better. So that definitely plays, I think, a crucial role, in almost anything. And especially if, you're a founding father that wants to establish a country and have some sense of trying to find the best way how to fit square pegs into round holes. You can only work with so much of a system of governance from what you previously had, and from what you previously came from. So therein lies, the virtues. Therein lies the that building of momentum and how to solve those problems for what plagued that time period. And I think looking at it as objectively as possible, to hop on the conspiracy train and, like you said, build your own narrative, because a lot of people, will cry wolf the whole time and forget and tread over, these points of view, and not have, a concrete understanding of, well, if Jefferson was a little bit more like Plato and less like Aristotle, maybe we would have had a different twist on states' rights. Maybe we would have had a different twist on how he viewed slavery, how he could have become an abolitionist and spurned the revolution against slavery. There's a lot of nuances, but when you think of what if and what could be, that definitely gives you some kind of, objectional rationalization to what happened. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. Well, Western and I don't think Western civilization has a monopoly on revolutions at all. I just think there is a different sensibility about it. There is obviously an established way they went about it, because then people forget a lot of the diplomatic relations that went on between Great Britain, or the United Kingdom, and what was becoming the United States. And I think a lot of people forget that a lot of those negotiations were peaceful. A lot of those negotiations were, not done in war rooms and on battlefields. They were done in Parliament. They were done in, with letters being penned to the king, to the British Parliament, and then being sent back. A lot of people forget that a lot of diplomacy was already going on, during that time period in the war. And, the war, the old saying goes, the pen was mightier than the sword. And that was one of the first times in history where that actually rang true.
Yeah, you could say that. Mostly in that the war was a very unpopular one at home in Britain. Like, you could say that the Revolutionary War really was Britain's Vietnam, in a sense. It was a war that, was quite controversial, quite unpopular for people to be fighting, largely because of that spirit of English liberty. Everybody was like, so let me get this straight. We're going to go over across the Atlantic and go murder Englishmen because they don't like what we're doing, and then, the part of the faction, mostly the Whigs, wanted to just kind of let them go and do their own thing. And then there were reformists who thought that they could, try to acquiesce and maybe accommodate some of the colonists' needs, but there are too many different factions to really agree on anything. And there's also one of the things that gets overlooked when looking at the American Revolution is the context that it takes place in the age of sail. And transatlantic communication was far from perfect during this time. And it had a great deal of delays. It would take months for a message to go from one side of the Atlantic to the other, during which time the circumstances of the war, or before the war, of the conditions on the ground in the colonies could change drastically. Nobody really knew what the current up-to-date information for what was going on happened to be. And I feel like a lot of the crises in the colonies sort of spiraled out of control of the British government before they really knew what was going on. In a lot of cases, they didn't really understand just how severe the grievances of the colonies really were. A lot of times they probably early on saw them as being kind of ridiculous and petulant, especially a lot of the tax-related ones. And then they're just like, well, whatever, this will blow over, let's just continue with business as usual on our more important things here at home. And until one day, they see, boom, the colonies are in open rebellion, and just everything kind of spirals out of control. By the time they're ready to compromise, it's too late. And then you have the fact that it's not just Parliament, you've also got the king involved. You've got all these different factors that have to line up in order to get a negotiated solution. That just didn't happen. But yeah, once again, with the talking about the English being inherently revolutionary people, I would actually argue it's an inherent reaction rather than an inherent revolution. Because you talk about the papacy, there is a strong case made by many in the orthosphere, in kind of the Western Orthodox, English speaking Orthodox world, that the effects of the Great Schism did not reach the British Isles until 1066 with the Norman invasion. And what this amounted to was it was a papal blessed, and these people argue papal backed, Norman conquest of the native English monarchy. And William the Bastard, who became the conqueror, imported all these continental bishops and churchmen to take over the English church hierarchy with him. The theory is that this was bringing the effects of the Great Schism to Britain. Because interestingly enough, there had been a major issue between the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Pope at the time. I believe for some reason they weren't in communion. I would have to look at that again exactly to see the exact source on that. But yeah, like they weren't in communion for some reason. And there are hints that the English had some inkling, at least towards Constantinople, in the decades after the conquest with the English exiles. Because where did they go? Most of them didn't really go to France or Germany or anywhere nearby that you'd think they would fit in, or Scandinavia. The most notable group went to the Byzantine Empire. They went under the Emperor of the Romans and formed the bulk of the Varangian Guard, his elite Norse and English bodyguards, after 1066. And they even founded a little colony on the Black Sea. There was a New England before New England. It was a very small colony somewhere on the Black Sea, and it's lost. Nobody knows where it actually was. But now they imported priests from Hungary, which was in the Western Rite, but I think that was just because they only knew Latin for their liturgy. So that's why they did that. But there's little hints of that it perhaps was a bit more of a conservative revolution, if you will. And that it wasn't so much trying to impose a new thing, at least at first, as much as it was trying to defend what they had lost, or what the old tradition was from innovation.
Okay. Well, I mean, a lot of revolution does come out of reaction. I mean, and obviously, there needs to be an equal and opposite action to have a reaction. So with that, like spirit that the English have held on to, and them trying to, spread their empire, number one. And number two, I think that was pretty interesting that you brought up the Archbishop of Canterbury. That guy was quite a anti-papist from what I can remember and from what I heard about him. He was one of the first ones to create a stink outside of, the Orthodox Church to, be like, hey, Pope, what are you doing? You know what? I don't like it, so I'm not going to listen to you anymore. And you're right. I mean, it was a strange thing that they were like out of communion. I forgot what exactly it was. But that's what caused, in a sense, Anglicanism to become what it was. And you're right. In the Orthosphere, we like to say England was Orthodox before it became Anglicanism, which is kind of strange because you had the Normans, and the Normans were highly influential throughout Europe, for sure. But that reaction is always something that is interesting to me, when it comes to almost anything political or religious. Because do I think it's something that it is it's almost innately human. Um I mean, obviously animals react to things. Nature, you know, you react to it, we react with it. Um, you know, but there's something so, and I don't want to get like completely gnostic about it. But there's something so innately human about reaction and revolution. Um, and like you said, there's a duty, and there is definitely a duty to, to carry out things that you think have to be done. Like, if the government does become too tyrannical, well then yeah, I mean, justice literally becomes duty. You have to do something about it. Um so to me, not only would you be reacting to a situation of a tyrannical government, well, now with that reaction, your penchant for what you think would be your best ideal for justice, turns into what the government would see as a revolutionary reaction to, a revolution to what you think is tyrannical. So, I mean, throughout history, that's that's a dime a dozen at times. And picking the good ones out of the bad ones. Well, then, I mean, that depends on, somebody's worldview completely. That depends on people's opinions and stuff. And I always think it's funny, you never talk about politics or religion, with in polite company, or with people you don't really know and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, but there's something so innately human about it, like the Looney Tune left, just now living in the post Orange Man bad era. Like what who do they have to revolt against? They got nobody that they can react and revolt against anymore. Because there's no Orange Man bad alert of the day. There's no DEFCON 5. What do we got to worry about? What he said today. So, to me, America has always had that kind of attitude about stuff, as misguided as it is by by the left. There's still a sense of it there. It's just kind of obviously strange to us normal people, which are in the majority, on how they react to those things, how overtly ridiculous it becomes at times. And it constitutes a meme for sure. But I would say that history, looking at it from not your point of view, like you said, it's very myopic to just look at it from our point of view and not know the extension of what it was, before that, after that, during that time period, and just looking at that. Well, I guess I'm going to say it, that spirit of revolution, and what it embodied, and what the purpose was for that reaction.
Yeah. Talking about the left and their reactions. Well, what they're going to do now that they don't have Orange Man, and what they're already doing is critical race theory. Whitey is the enemy as a whole. That is the left's fundamental, and it was always what they were against. they didn't hate Trump for Trump. They hated Trump because of what he represented. They hated Trump because he represented sort of that backlash of white America to them. That's why they were mad at him. Trump himself, he was kind of just a big orange buffoon who really, honestly, didn't accomplish that much in office, frankly. Like, he did a few good things, but they were mostly just reversals of things that were under Obama. Most of what he did, completely failed long term to bring about the things that he claimed to support, and arguably gave the left so much energy and vigor in opposing him because suddenly they kind of woke up. They're like, oh crap, we need to go in overdrive because they're waking up. So that's the thing. He's a small part of a much bigger picture. He was never the main issue in this debate. But people like to paint people as being the object of their ire or somebody they can point to because it's very easy to point to a person and blame things on them when really that's not what they're blaming. That's not what they have a problem with in reality. It's what they project. It's a similar issue to King George. Everybody thought that George III was the great embodiment of their enemy in America, of the tyranny they faced, when it was all Parliament. And most of the smart people knew this. But it was very easy when trying to spread propaganda or trying to create a narrative that, King George bad, and in a much similar vein to Orange Man bad. So that's all it really is. And yeah, you've got things like that, but that's the fundamental narrative, right? Critical theory, the only reason they even support that is because it fundamentally breaks down society as a whole. They target whites because we embody the traditional system of God. We embody Christendom. That's really, I think, what the ultimate people who really orchestrate this up on high, a lot of the, frankly, Satanist people who are honestly, I won't want to say in charge of this, but behind it, so to speak. And you can say whatever groups you think are involved with that. That's outside the scope of this discussion. Clearly, there's satanic influence, and they are destroying the white race. They're destroying Christianity. They're destroying Christendom, the remnants of the establishment of Christianity, because it represents God's natural order. That is the target. Fundamentally, Satan, what is he? He is the rebel against God. He is the one who says, I can do better than you, God. I can create my own order, independent of yours, that will beat yours. And that's what he's trying to do. That's all this is. It's just a rebellion against reality. Gnosticism. It's the same thing. It's all just fundamentally based on opposing the creator of the world. And that's just the grand thing you have to keep in your mind when you're dealing with any of these people. That's the fundamental base truth at the base of it all.
Yep. I mean, that's what it is. I mean, when they say, it's the personification of evil. It's more so what the people who he represented are just reprehensible. Well, okay, or what was the other one? The other meme. Hillary called us a basket of deplorables. There was that whole thing, whole spiel going around, which was pretty enjoyable, especially when it came to boomers. But Christendom is, I don't want to say it's almost synonymous with European culture and Western culture, but in a sense it really is. We don't have a monopoly on it for sure. I don't want to proclaim that it's just ours and ours only, because that's obviously heresy. But yeah, that's the spirit of revolution and that's where it spurns from. Spirit of revolution did come from Satan. him falling from grace and becoming something that was warped, that was corrupted, that turned into sin. And then he corrupted, and then eventually corrupted God's ultimate creation, man. Or, well, I don't know if it's God's ultimate. That's a whole different story. But God's creation, us, man. And saying that you eat this fruit. Well, now you have now you have knowledge. Well, now you have knowledge of things. Yeah, and these things are outside of God and what God wanted for us. So then that influence is there, and then we fell out of grace from God because of Satan. And a lot of people that are, well, I guess Gnostic, I guess pagan, all those other derivatives that I can't even think of off the top of my head right now. Probably see revolution differently than I would say Christians do. And they probably, I see some of them online as a reaction to Christianity, because Christianity was a Semitic religion, or is a Semitic religion. We all know where that goes. But usually you just overtly just said it like they were, they're Satanists. And that's more so the overt evil, the overt problem. It's not just a specific group of people. However, there's people that are behind the scenes, and I don't want to get all Alex Jones on you, but they're obviously, they've been against God from the get-go, and they think that they can do better. And the whole ghosts, UFOs, I saw Bigfoot, kind of deal. Yeah, I mean, it's there. It's definitely there. But that's definitely not on topic of what we're talking about at all. So there's that, there's that, always that sense of something's out there, something's coming, and well, none of it comes from God. So it's strange. It's a strange headspace. It's a strange thing to kind of wrap your mind around. Because of the belief and where Christendom kind of took Western civilization. It could be argued that Asian civilizations have very similar values, have very similar pathos, ethos, and telos, over their whole shtick too. But they obviously are more Gnostic and more, they've embodied more so the more natural aspects of their societies and their and in their revolutionary spirit. They've gone more so of the eternal at peace with the world kind of thought process. And their virtues being completely different across the board throughout their various cultures. Whereas you see a commonality with Europeans, and for them to be so vitriolic against God, who is our ultimate creator. You see, I'm sorry, I'm not talking about the Asians anymore. That the Satanists, they want their freedom of religion here in the United States. Okay, in a sense, you can have it, but I just saw something. 3 years ago. Yeah, 3 years ago. Right outside Lansing City Hall, they wanted a statue of Baphomet, and they were using Christianity as to weaponize it against us, against Christians, saying, "Oh well, it must have been Christians that came up to our statue of Baphomet and splattered, paint all over them, and then they must have, like taken, I guess, like a hammer or chisel or whatever, and started smashing pieces away from Baphomet. They're degrading him, and stuff." And I'm like, well, he's the devil. But the other part is like, there's always that spirit of revolution can be warped, and that's obviously a very warped way to look at, revolution in defiance of God. So, I mean, and this is kind of off. Well, it's kind of in line, but when you have something like that infecting local politics, I mean, dang. I mean, you don't know that the revolution is here until it's on your doorstep, because it won't be televised, and you get that you get that eerie feeling that your duty is now to obviously protect something like Christianity, because it is such a valuable, well, code of ethics. It's a valuable belief system, obviously. But there's obviously something just so intrinsically transcendental to us, and to have that innate ability across, I don't know your background when it comes to your European heritage, but across not only us as Europeans, well, descendants of Europeans, now Americans, but across the board. I mean, you think about this in a bigger context, not only from the founding fathers and them wanting to establish a Christian nation, with touches of secularism definitely involved. But then you have it clear across the board where, you had the Chinese Revolution going on, and part of that reason the Chinese Revolution went on was because of Christianity. They wanted to establish Christianity, in the Orthodox Church in China. So it's not entirely, Europeans don't have a monopoly, like I said, on Christianity at all. But where does something like that come from? How is people on the other side of the world, away from the primarily Christian population of the world, why do they have that spirit? Why do they have that sense of, oh, we can make changes through this if we believe in Christ? It's really kind of strange on how that kind of manifests itself within humanity and how it comes about. And the Ethiopians even have it too. The Ethiopian Orthodoxy is probably the oldest established form of Christianity there is. And I'm not very well versed on whether they're heretical or not, but from what I've heard, they're pretty much in line. I mean, there's some stuff that's probably, well, but then who's to say we're completely clean? Because obviously we're not, being Greek Orthodox. But that, there's that back and forth and stuff, and then you have those nuanced viewpoints, and I'm not going to even get into that. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is that there's that shared spirit, and where would that even come from? A population clearly across the world that, you know, they only had a couple of saints, you know, even show up, or missionaries even show up to their country, and they still continue on, you know, with that kind of spirit, you know, and to have that innately in them to carry on a Christian tradition in their country.
Yeah. And you talk about orthodoxy. There's also a very heavy Protestant missionary presence in China as well. Just as much, if not more so, than the Orthodox throughout most of the country, especially the relevant areas to the revolution, which are mostly in southern China. But yeah, there was a definite contribution of Christianity to the Chinese revolutionary idea in the early 20th century and in the 19th century as well. And they developed syncretistic local religions out of it that have much more in common with the Asian religious tradition than they do with actual Christianity. The Taiping Rebellion, which was, I believe, the third deadliest war in history, was just a long Chinese civil war. It was over this man called Hong Jiquan, who proclaimed to be the brother of our Lord Jesus Christ. Which, as funny as that sounds to us, this was a very serious proclamation. It was millenarian, like kind of the view that the end of the world is coming, and you know they needed to sort of take action, like they were going to bring on Armageddon by fighting a holy war against the foreign Manchu Qing dynasty. So yeah, they had a whole world. Chinese Christianity is a topic for a whole podcast in on itself, honestly. But on that note, we've been going for almost 2.5 hours now. So I'm not sure if you really want to continue much longer, or if we want to kind of call it now, because we've covered just about all the topics we were going to. I mean, we've covered the American Revolution solidly, I think. And all kinds of tangential topics that related to it. So I don't know if we want to make kind of a little outro, or maybe even record a little bit of an intro to kind of tack onto the front after we're done here.
Cue elevator music. Got any good elevator music? Because I don't.
Good elevator music. That's that's a conundrum right there.
Could spurn another revolution. Yeah. Okay. We definitely did cover some good topics. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure, man. It'll be good to keep going with this and see what we can come up with at a later time. But anyhow, I get you can probably cut it off right there. But after that, though, I don't know if you want me to just say a little, if you want to, or you want me to say a little intro, or we even just introduce ourselves individually.
And for sure.
Cut it off at the end and then just tack it onto the front.
Yeah, I could do that.
And then I don't know if you want to have like a name for this little podcast. I mean, we could come up with one afterwards and tack it to the front of even that, I guess. But,
yeah.
I don't know. But yeah, so I guess you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then I'll introduce myself, and then we can call it quits.
Well, I mean, I got nothing to hide. My name's obviously the bottom corner.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, like, you know, just like imagine someone's firing this up.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, like an intro.
Hi, everybody. I'm JP. I'm on here with Burger Meister, and we're going to talk about the American Revolution and then cover some other various topics. And if we get a little bit tangential with it, well, that comes with the territory.
Oh, tangents are our specialty here. So, you know, there's a subject matter. We'll see how much we'll stick to it. But anyway, y'all enjoy.
Sweet.
All right. Well, I guess that's good then. So it's been a pleasure, man.
For sure.
All right. Bye.
Bye.